I will also tell something about Jamey Allen. He has been studying beads for many years, and he's the founding member of the Bead Society of Northern California and co-founder of the Society of Bead Researchers. Jamey is also a consulting curator for the Bead Museum in Glendale, Arizona, until it was closed in 2011. He studies beads of all materials, ages, and cultural origins, and he gives consultations to museums, other institutions, and private collectors. He has written many articles and books about beads, and recently wrote the book Wild Beads of Africa, about the collection of Billy Steinberg. And that's where he's going to tell about now. Well, you're welcome, Jamey. The word is to you.
Thank you. Well, I am delighted to be here and to share the experience of producing this book with my friend Billy Steinberg. This is Billy. Billy is an internationally celebrated musician and songwriter, but for nearly 30 years now, he has been very immersed in collecting and studying beads. And he particularly likes Venetian beads and African beads. And he has assembled a world-class collection of very important old beads from West Africa, mostly found in the region of Ghana. And he has what I believe is the most astounding private collection of these artifacts anywhere outside of Africa. Billy and I have been friends for well over 20 years. I advise him a lot. He shares information with me. He shows me things. And really for about 10 years, we discussed the idea of collaborating on a book. And eventually we decided to do Wild Beads of Africa. And I should say, people do have some tendency to misunderstand the title of the book. It's not a reflection of African culture in any way. It's the way Billy looks at these beads, and he associates them with the Fauve movement in Europe and the paintings of Matisse and other artists who were renowned for their use of wild color. And Billy looks at these beads and he thinks of them similarly, and that's how he came up with the name. Right now we are looking at a collection of beads that belong to a mutual friend of ours, and these are some of the beads that we will be talking about this morning. But although this is a very nice collection, it is not an astounding collection, and I'm going to hope to astound you with the variety of beads that Billy has in his collection. When we did this book, we wanted to show very specific beads, and we ruled out showing others. And we wanted to describe what we can understand about them, their cultural context, how they were made, when they were made, and their variety of appearance. So this is a graphic that shows the various shapes and actual specimens that I used to codify this and make the generalizations of shape and size variations. A lot of people popularly call these beads badam, however you want to spell and pronounce that, but that actually is not the name that Africans traditionally use for them. And I don't call them that, and I don't recommend that anybody else call them that. But I'm going to begin by showing you some of the most classic, impressive, and excellent specimens of these beads. And of course, you can't tell what the size of them is, but these are really quite big. Old African powderglass beads, well, they vary remarkably in size, but they can be up to 3 inches or even 4 inches in diameter. So these are called cruciform beads, and they're called that because they have a 4-pointed pattern. And you can see, looking at the side and the top view, that the decorations extend all the way to the perforation due to the manipulation of the glass, which we'll talk a little bit about. This is Billy's excellent specimen collection of oblate and oval or biconical cruciform beads. And you can see that there's a great variety of the kinds of patterns, the colors, the proportion of the designs versus the canvas of the bead. One of the things that we know technically about these beads is that they are made from powder glass that's been pulverized, composed, and fused. And typically these beads have a black or dark gray base, and then they have a skin of often yellow glass around them. So we're looking at a broken bead so that we can get a better view of the composition of making one of these beads. Most African powder glass beads have been made by taking beads that come to the African people, and they grind them up, they create them, they grind them to a crushed powder-like consistency, and then they use them to compose beads. These are some of the beads that we believe were used to make the outside colors of many of the yellow powder glass beads. It's also important to understand the elements that they use when they decorate these beads. And right now we're looking at two kinds of Venetian trade beads. On the left, we have what are called galets rouges in French Africa, or green hearts by American collectors. And on the right, what the Italians call cornalina d'Aleppo beads, or what Americans call white heart beads. Both of these beads are used as decorative elements in manufacturing old powder glass beads. And that's interesting because we know from research that the cornalina d'Aleppo beads only came into existence in about 1825 and don't appear in the archaeological record until about 1830. So that gives us sort of a ballpark figure of when these beads were manufactured. That is to say, when the powder glass beads were manufactured. So we're looking at a squat bicone on the left and a 16th century Venetian chevron bead on the right. So one of the ways these beads are elevated and become status items is if they have important beads on them. And you can see here that pieces of chevron beads have been applied to the bead on the left in its manufacture. Also, the industry of making powder glass beads continues to this day, and the gentlemen mostly in Africa who make them try very hard to make reproductions of old-time powder glass beads, but they don't understand the technology well enough to really make a true reproduction. So in this shot, we're looking at an authentic powder glass bead from about 100, 150 years ago on the left, and a reproduction that probably would have been made sometime in the last 10 or 15 years on the right. This is a pair of cruciform powder glass beads that are really unusual because of the pale teal color of the ground, but otherwise very typical. In these two beads, the appliques that are on them are merely circular. They're concentric circles, one inside of the other. And it is my belief that in the manufacture of cruciform beads, they would have started off with something like this, and then using a tool, they would move the glass around when it was in a molten state to make the four corners of the cross, creating the cruciform design. A related kind of bead has the same sort of manipulation of the glass, but in this case, instead of 4 directions, it's been combed in 8 directions. We call these amoebas, amoeba beads. Now that's our name, and we have no idea what the names Africans would use. On the right here, we have a really excellent early Venetian bead, probably from 150 years ago. And on the left, we see the African version of it. So one of the things that the makers of these beads wanted to do was to create beads that would be their own beads, but that would be inspired by beads that they already admired and perhaps were very rare and expensive. So this is a pretty reasonable attempt at making a copy of the bead we see on the right. In the African trade, these are popularly called king beads. And what we see is an African-made powder glass bead in the middle being flanked by 2 Venetian beads. And you can see that they have gone to some trouble to actually copy the look of these beads. And also what happens that we can find Venetian trade beads that have patterns on them that resemble cruciform designs. And I don't believe that the Venetians were trying to do that when they created these beads. It's just as coincidental that occasionally they have a pattern that looks like a cruciform pattern. What these beads actually copy is something entirely different, and it's something I've published on, but we don't need to talk about it now. Mostly in the world where glass beads are made, decorations on beads are produced by trailing, where glass is liquefied, turned into a little stream, and then applied to a bead, kind of like painting with melted glass. In the case of old African powder glass beads, they didn't really have the ability to do that. So what they could do was make little sticks of glass, and then they would attach those to the beads and then fuse them in. And this is a great example where you can see, looking at the edges of these little sticks, how they have wrapped around and haven't been so fused in that they sort of become one with the surface that they're embedded into. So this is a clue about how these beads were made some time ago. This is another example where we can actually see the little sticks of blue and red glass that have been fused onto the pale yellow background. There are two big schools of powder glass bead making from the period that we're speaking of, which is 100 to 150, almost 200 years ago. And right now we're looking at the second school, and this is a family that has the name Akoso. Akoso literally means crossed lines. And the people who made the cruciform beads are not the same people who made these beads. And really the truth is we don't know who made any of these beads, although the cruciform and related beads are believed popularly to have been made by Krobos. And Krobos are happy to think of themselves as their ancestors having made these beads. Nobody is taking credit for the Akoso beads, on the other hand. I'll show you a few Akoso beads so we can see the crossed. They look like two hairpins that crisscross one another, and then they have additional adventitious decoration. And there are different shapes and different pattern theories. These beads have what look like figure eights with rings in them. But many of them are tall with crossed lines. And then we have here little pieces of chevron beads that have been applied to this. These are green chevron beads. This, I think, is a really great one. I think Billy would love this for its art sense and the image that it creates. And looking at the detail on the right, we can actually see the elements that were fused together to make these medallions. And probably anytime we see red like this red comes from the Galet Rouge beads or the green heart beads. This is another one, and we can actually see that these are pieces of green heart beads by the fact that we can see the red glass and behind it the green glass that is the interior. So these are green heart beads that have been shattered, and pieces that they liked, they've selected and then have added to the surface of the beads. And in the lower right, we can see they used a little striped black bead with red and white stripes. And here we see this closer. Almost any time that we see this beautiful crimson, opaque brick red glass in one of these powder glass beads, we usually will be able to see the translucent or transparent green glass associated with it behind it. The thing that typically joins all of the Akoso beads together is that they, unlike the cruciform beads and their like, Akoso beads do not have a very dark gray or black interior. They have a much lighter gray interior, which we can see around the equator of this bead. This is a bead that actually copies an ancient Middle Eastern bead, and they've done a pretty reasonable job of making a facsimile of it. Unfortunately, I don't have on hand a prototype to show you. Excuse me. I don't think that this is a terribly beautiful bead, but it is a tour de force of powder glass manufacture to have created all of these little appliques and get them fused onto the bead. And note also the little pieces of chevron beads that are peppered all around it. Now, there's no reasonable way of dividing all of these beads into groups and saying anything authoritative or intelligent about them. Basically, they are what they are. And from here on out, I'm just going to start with simple beads and show you more and more complicated beads and other variations. So we can see here that typical old powder glass beads with the with the dark black base and yellow exterior can be plain beads. They don't always have decorations on them. They also can have very simple decorations. And here we see a Galet Rouge bead that's been formed into a circle. And I think there probably are 3 of these around the equator of this bead. A typical thing in trade beads and ancient glass beads and among these powder glass beads is to simply make nice striped combinations. And this is a group of black beads that have various tones of green stripes in different shapes and sizes. And again, just a variety of beads that are striped. In this case, the stripe units that we see as pink have actually been made from white heart beads, where they have taken beads that are opaque white and translucent red and melted them together and then stretched them. And so the color has become pink. And they then have been made into appliques and placed onto and fused into these green powder glass beads. In this instance, we see a bead that probably has 3 of these medallions or shields. And again, we can see the actual texture of the Galet Rouge beads and some indication of the green glass that in this case looks sort of grayish. And so they've taken these beads, stretched them out into trails, we'll say, formed them into concentric circles, or maybe this is a spiraling circle, and then taken that unit and fused it onto the side of this bead. From very early times in glass bead making anywhere in the world, one of the techniques that was very typically used by many different industries is the technique of trailing and then combing. And then a pointed implement is used to manipulate the glass when it's in a very liquid state to make what were originally parallel stripes become zigzags. And this is a pair probably made by the same person at about the same time, but in instances like this, Billy probably collected these beads one by one, and it's just coincidental that he managed to get 2 that come from the same, probably from the same maker. This is one of my favorite beads in Billy's collection, and in fact, I had the job of bringing this to the person who sold it to Billy. So I was familiar with this bead before Billy bought it. And I really think it's extraordinary. It's so much like great modern art that is abstract. And in this case, we see a typical old powder glass bead, again with a black base, with a yellow skin, and then random little trails put all over it. This is another bead that harkens back to antiquity. And what they have done in this instance is to make a pad of glass using striped rods, like little candy canes or barber poles. And they put all of these rods together parallel and then take this pad and wrap it around a mandrel to form a bead. So if we look carefully, I think in our next picture, nope, I didn't show it. If you look through the perforation at the top, you can see that on the interior, it has exactly the same design as the exterior. So this is how rolled pad beads were made, beginning in the Roman period around 2,000 years ago, up through the Islamic period about 1,000 years ago. Many, many old or ancient beads are made by the rolled pad method, but this is the only powder glass bead we've seen that is made this way. And I wanted to show this bead because, again, it just has an abstract pattern on it that is somehow very pleasing, but as far as we can determine, doesn't represent anything in particular. Beads like this seem to be inspired by Middle Eastern beads that were traded to West Africa about 1,000 years ago. And their decoration consists of pieces of ribbon glass that have been randomly fused onto the black surface. So we suppose that this is probably a black bead through and through with black and multicolored decoration. Another cross, but a very distinctive one since the arms end in curlicues. And if there's some symbolism related to this, it's unknown to us, but of course we would be interested to know what it is. And this is sort of the higher octave of that. And I like to call this the Tic-Tac-Toe Bead, where instead of having one single cross, this has sort of two double crosses. Notice that the piece in the upper right is not continuous with the rest of it. They seem to have patched that in, so maybe the element broke when it was being fused together. But it's a very unusual pattern and also an unusual color combination. These, I think, are really quite wonderful beads. They have been made from striped units fused around a mandrel, probably a number of times, so that they have a spiral structure. And then these little elements have been placed on it that are daubed on from striped rods that have been attached, twisted, and separated. Or the right specimen actually has wreaths, which are lines of striped canes that have been turned into a circle and then applied to the beads. So these are also inspired by Venetian trade beads, and you can see that they would have liked this pattern enough to have made their own versions of them and done actually a pretty good job. This is a close-up. Again, when we see this, this is so much like abstract art, and it has such great appeal for the colors, the patterns, and the interplay between them. Really, really great beads. This is one of the very few figural beads that we know from this class of powderglass beads from Ghana. And I think we're right in saying that this is a figure. It seems to be an image of a little man with black hair. And we can see he has green fingers and toes. So that's an extremely rare bead, quite wonderful. And this is one of my favorite strands or groups of beads in Billy's collections, mostly because, well, of course, because they're very nicely made, but also they are such an unusual color scheme, being made with this opaque teal glass and then having very brilliant red and yellow decorations. And we can see here that there's one sort of cobalt blue version. These beads are extremely rare. And it's really, in many ways, astounding that Billy was able to get so many of them together in one place. And so this is my last picture, and I'm really surprised that I've managed to get through this so quickly, because usually I'm so wordy that I go on and on and on, and 40 minutes is over with before you know it. So,
well, maybe there are some questions.
Yes, I will be happy to take questions.
So you can either raise your hand. I will also have a look in the chat or the Q&A. I'll have a look, see. Some good mornings and everything. Yeah, I have a question from Sabina Fleary. I have some old glass powder beads from Ghana, and I wonder if Mr. Allen would want to have a look. Oh, that's not a question. That's just a request. Sorry.
Well, I would like to have a look.
Yeah, I'm sure. I have a question in the Q&A from Bennett McCradle. Can you tell us anything about who wore or used them?
Well, really, I cannot tell you very much. A lot of these beads are reportedly dug from the ground, but not necessarily from grave sites. They sometimes are buried for ritual purposes. And 100 years ago, apparently, the literature tells us from people traveling in West Africa, that African people believed that if you buried these beads in the ground, they would reproduce. And when you dug them up, there would be multiples of your bead, as though the beads were living beings that reproduced. In a general sense, it is broadly believed that the best, biggest, well-made old powder glass beads were only worn by royalty. Now we have the name Badam for these beads, and the reason that I don't call these beads that is because Badam is actually the name of the royal jewels of the Queen of the Ashanti. And nobody has seen her beads for 100 years. And I know someone who has tried to get an audience with her on several occasions so that he could see her beads, but she has always not been interested in talking to him or showing him anything. So we can speculate that the beads worn by royalty would include these big old powder glass beads, also gold beads, and also good, probably large, excellent Venetian beads from early trade days. However, the occasions which royalty wears these things is usually not something that would be photographed. So, you know, we don't have pictures of the royalty wearing any of these things, but presumably they are the intended owners and wearers of this kind of stuff. But how they wore them, when they wore them, you know, we can only vaguely surmise that.
I have another question of Marina Allen. Why African people crushed Venetian beads to produce their own?
Well, the reason that they take beads and they crush them to make beads is because they live in a pre-vitreous society. Glass making and glass working are not traditions of these people. The only people in West Africa who have a glass making and glass working tradition are people in Nigeria. And in fact, I have gone to Nigeria to visit them and document their manufacturing processes. And they claim that they came from Egypt, although they look like everyone else in their community. They do not look Egyptian. Really, a better question is, who introduced this idea of making beads from crushed glass and teaching it to some interested African person who then set about making these beads? We really don't know who that would be. But in any event, virtually all glass beads that are made in Africa, and particularly West Africa, are made by recycling glass that is available to them. And they could be beer bottles and Coke bottles and cold cream jars. And in recent years, window louvers and television screens and all kinds of things. So they are just exploiting the glass that's available to them.
Okay, even kijken. From Laurent, are there different techniques to pierce the beads or enlarge the hole?
Well, these beads have been made on iron mandrels, and they are generally tapered mandrels. And we can always tell which is the top of the bead and which is the bottom of the bead, because the bottom always has the larger aperture. This comes from the tradition of making wound glass beads, where the glass is in a liquid state and is wound onto a mandrel and used to form the body of the bead. But in this case, because these beads are entirely powder glass, we can only speculate how the bases are constructed. There are people who think that these beads are made entirely in molds, I have demonstrated how that can not be possible at all. And I have a supposition about how they made the bases using only powdered glass. But in any event, when making beads, if the bead is created around a mandrel or a rod, the bead is removed from the rod and thus the perforation is there. And with these beads and many other beads, especially from antiquity, the perforations are more often than not slightly tapered.
Another question from Gioconda. In what type of fumas, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, were this bead made?
Well, since we don't know who made the beads, and we only have the belief that we accept that Krobos made them, and they were making them about 100 to 150 to maybe a little farther ago, a little longer ago, we can assume that they would have been made in Ghana. Now, the Krobos believe that they made powder glass beads when they were living on Krobo Mountain. When the Krobos moved to Ghana from elsewhere in Central Africa, the British sort of rounded them up and they moved their enclave onto Krobo Mountain. And the belief is held that this is where the beads were made. And when I went to Ghana in 1998, one of our informants took us to Krobo Mountain and showed us the fire pit where they believe these beads were made. But I looked at it and I said, well, you know, this could be a barbecue for somebody's dinner. I have no reason to believe that this is a glassworking station, but I can't say that it was not. But the fact is and remains, we really don't know who made these beads or what their location was. We only know that they are popular with Krobo and Ashanti people who all live in Ghana, and that they will take credit for the manufacture of some of these beads, but not all of them.
I have a question from Leonore. Who were the people making them? Did they have a special status in the royal court?
Well, again, unfortunately, that would be very unknown. I think we can accept it as a truism that anybody who works in pyrotechnical productions is considered to be an important person in their community. And, you know, in ancient times, they probably would have been considered to be wizards for the ability to melt glass or work metal or any of the other pyrotechnical arts. So I suppose they would have a certain status. In modern times, the people who make powder glass beads in Ghana in the 20th century, among them, there are practitioners who make very specific kinds of beads that they devised and produced, and we know their names because they're considered important and famous. But old powder glass beads come from so long ago that we know virtually nothing about the people who made them.
Von Martine. Hi Jamey, what is the main difference between the old first generation production and the later ones, which still include green hearts? Is there a style evolution or different colors used over time? Or is it hard to put them in time slots?
No, actually, this is one of the things that we discuss in our book with some detail. The profound difference between the manufacture of old powder glass beads and current powder glass beads is really quite significant. I've been talking a little bit about how I believe and how we have published that the old beads were made and that they were hot worked and that they created a certain kind of trailing of the decorative elements and then applied them to the bead. And that things such as the combed beads indicate that the glass was taken to a very molten level. And all of this would be on a mandrel, and it would be near a fire or, well, it would be a fire, we'll say a furnace. And the glass was essentially hot worked, whereas the contemporary industries in West Africa that make powder glass beads take a very different approach. All of the work is done inside a mold, and it's how they stack the glass inside the mold that determines what the bead is going to look like. But when you look at a new powder glass bead and an old powder glass bead side by side, you can see the flow of the glass in the old beads, whereas all of the decorations and the surface of new beads are splintery because they basically are nothing more than granules of glass that have been sintered or fused together. So my personal hope in having produced the book that we did is that this will inspire African glass workers to experiment with doing the kinds of molten decorations that were produced 150 years ago. I know one gentleman who has 3 factories in Krobo land, and he's internationally famous. He goes by the name CD. And many of you maybe have heard of CD. CD has a new book that's just come out recently, and it's really quite fun and interesting to see, and gives a very different slant on African beads than I, as a Westerner observing, would have. And also he uses very different terms than I do. But in any event, CD has created a hot working or lamp working studio at his compound, and he's totally proficient at making conventional glass beads. So he would be an excellent candidate to make realistic reproductions of old powder glass beads if he chose to do that.
I can say to Kim, who said she missed the beginning, I have taped the lecture, so you can always see the beginning on YouTube later. And I have a question from Hans. Was there a binder used?
A binder?
A binder, yeah.
We don't know. And it is possible a binder as simple as water could have been used in the manufacture of the base. Certainly, what we have, abstractly speaking, is a dry pack or a wet pack theory happening. And there are 3 big groups of powder glass bead makers in West Africa. They are in Mauritania, Ghana, and Nigeria. We believe that in Nigeria, they did dry packing and wet packing. In Ghana, in the current industry, they only use dry packing. And in Mauritania, they only use wet packing. And the binder that they use in Mauritania is actually the lady's saliva. And so she crushes the glass to the right consistency, and then she spits into the container and makes it into a paste. And apparently they might add a little water and a little gum to it as well. But for old powder glass beads, we have no idea whether or not they used any kind of a binding medium.
Okay. What is the name of the Nigerian ethnic group to make glass beads?
They are Nupe.
Nupe. I recall a story about bottoms as barking or speaking beads, warning owners of danger. Is there anything you can tell us about this story, or is it a myth?
Well, I think it sort of has to be a myth. All I can imagine is that if you had these beads and you were wearing them and they rubbed one another, they might make a noise that would rustle or something, but it would be rather fortuitous circumstances where it certainly became something like a bark. I don't know. I don't know You know, it's always easy to believe that legend or mythology is based on some kind of real experience, but we may not know exactly what that is. So I wouldn't dismiss it as impossible. I just don't know what it is.
I have a question for Maria, and I can ask her to unmute herself so she can ask the question herself. See if that works. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're there.
Hi.
Hello, Maria.
Hello. I just wondered about the designs. If you found the same designs in other artifacts, like textile or any other ceramics or other things, so we know that they are made by Africans in the beginning.
We do find a few motives that you can see in textiles and beadwork. The idea of two loops that cross one another, not forming an X, but forming a cross is definitely a symbol in West African culture. I associate mostly with Nigeria, not so much with Ghana. But for the most part, my impression is that the designs on these beads either imitate the patterns we see on ancient Middle Eastern or Egyptian beads or modern trade beads. That is pretty much the inspiration for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have one last question. Let me have a look. Oh, that's also for Maria. That we already had that question. From Martina, but within the range of rod-made beads, is there an evolution noticeable?
Maybe theoretically, since we have no way of dating these beads other than to theorize based on the glass that is used for making them. We have at this time a very vague time sense. Now, beads that were not included in our book because they are not early are believed to date from about the 1920s and later. And the reason that we believe that they are not early is because the glasses that are used have a very different chemistry. And instead of this nice golden, tawny yellow that we see in all of the beads that we've looked at today, there's a bright, strident acid yellow. And we know from European glass chemistry that those colors, those sort of acid colors, acid green, yellow, and bright red, all date from about 1920. And, you know, it might be 1918 or 1917, but the earliest dated specimens that we know of were literally dated to 1920s. And we know that throughout the 20s and 30s, Venetians made a lot of beads using these acidic looking colors that were minerally colored with cadmium and selenium. So that was new chemistry at the time. So we can separate the earliest powder glass beads from the second generation of them that would have commenced around the 1920s. But I can't really say much about how they would have evolved stylistically over time. I could really only guess, and it would be more or less my imagination, I think.
Well, one last final question from Sam. Very interesting lecture, James, thank you. Is there a holy grail type of West African bead that is extremely rare?
Well, probably the jewels of the royal families are so rare that nobody has ever seen them, you know, and I can only imagine that the Akan, because they were gold workers, and we know from the little that we do know that royalty likes big beads. So I imagine that there are huge or big gold beads that would probably knock our eyes out. And some interesting gold Akan beads do come into the marketplace, and they're always astounding to see. I know a few people who have whole strands of them, and they've been published online, so you can see things like this once in a while. But throughout Africa, the beads that are the most valued traditionally have been the extraordinary Venetian beads that are large, intricate, and beautifully made. And I've shown you some of those today. But I can't think of anything that tops everything else.
Well, I think you have one last question, which I have two people asking for the title of the book you mentioned about Mr. CD.
Our book is called Wild Beads of Africa.
No, the book from of this CDs you're talking about?
Oh, CD's book?
Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yeah, yeah. But
right.
here's the book. The Art of Recycled?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's the new book.
And this is CD on the back.
Okay.
The Art of Recycled Glass Beads.
Okay, well,
Hot
great.
off the press.
Well, thank you very much, Jamey. I think there was a lot of interest and nice questions, and we're very happy that you stayed up for us to give us this lecture. And thank you all. It was a pleasure. Yeah, very nice. Thank you. And thank you for listening. And well, we'll hope to see you again.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Bye. Bye.